supervise. I think Tony now welcomes our people.
All right, if others join, you'll take care of admitting people so I don't have to worry about that little pop-up.
Oh, they're auto coming in right now. So we're all
Okay.
good. We have started the webinar. People are piling in. We're already at 30. And
Okay.
so Xiaowen will get us started here in a few moments.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Yeah, we got it. Now quite a few people are.
Yeah.
I'll get us going once I see the number of participants getting stabilized. Well, maybe we should get started. It's a few minutes after the top of the hour.
What is the audience seeing, me and the screen, or just the screen?
I think they see you as well as the screen.
Okay.
Yep. And once I have you introduced, I'll perhaps turn off my audio and video, and you will be the primary representation on everyone's screen.
Okay.
All right, let's get started. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our iGuide webinar series. I'm Xiaowen Wang at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. iGuide stands for Institute for Geospatial Understanding through Integrative Discovery Environment, supported by the National Science Foundation. Today's webinar, we are featuring a keynote speaker as part of our all-hands meeting. Running started from yesterday, Dr. Margaret Palmer. It's really my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Palmer, who's a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland. Actually, the broader community knows her well as the director of the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, NSF-funded center dedicated to creating actionable science related for the sustainability of socio-environmental systems. Margaret really has a long, distinguished career. She oversees research focused on watershed science and restoration ecology. And over her career, she's recognized for many awards. She's a fellow of AAAS and the Ecological Society of America, among many other accolades. And also beyond her impactful research program, Dr. Palmer remains actively engaged and very passionate about science matters associated with national and local water policies and actions. It would take me quite a while to share with you her accomplishments and stories across her long distinguished career. I think in the interest of the time, I would pass the Zoom floor to her soon, but her topic, keynote titled, Looking Beyond Geospatial Cyberinfrastructure to Build Discovery Environments, which is really closely connected to what iGuide is aiming to pursue. So we're very much looking forward to your talk, Margaret, and thank you so much for being here with us today. The floor is yours, Margaret.
Thank you, and thank you, Xiaowen. I appreciate that nice introduction. So Xiaowen asked me to talk a little bit about my experiences, particularly in terms of collaboration, and much of that relates not only to my work, but also to my experience in directing the center that Xiaowen mentioned. And so sort of the subtitle of my talk is really focused on collaborative research, and I'm going to talk about what I think works and what also matters, and that'll make more sense in a few minutes. So water science bridges a lot of domains. So for example, as an aquatic ecologist, at least that was how I was trained at the interface of hydrology and ecology, I did have to know a lot about hydrology because that influences how organisms feed, where they live, et cetera, et cetera. And my good friend, Karin Prestegard, who's a geomorphologist, is also an example of someone that is a water scientist who's grounded in one discipline, but really knowledgeable in a lot of other areas. So for example, she knows a lot about geochemistry and in fact, biogeochemistry. This is very characteristic of many of us in the scientific disciplines that have become increasingly collaborative, but generally these collaborations are within the natural science domains. And just a little story that I think is interesting and is a nice backdrop to what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to probably beat up on some of my own earlier work because it gives some good examples of where we've been in terms of trying to collaborate. And initially, as I sort of alluded to, a lot of this was just within the biophysical sciences. This is a project that's over 20 years old that I did with a group of what at that time was considered phenomenally interdisciplinary. So we worked with someone Nancy Boxtel, who did land use projections largely based on hedonic models, economically based. And we were interested in asking how changes in land use influenced the ecology and stream ecosystems, particularly biodiversity. And we understood that to do that, we needed to know something about the habitat, which is the geomorphology in the stream. We needed to know something about the hydrology, but we also knew that land use change influences all these things. And what's humorous about this now is that we really thought about this in a way that one output from, for example, the land use projections would feed into a model for the next output, which would then feed into another model for the next output. So we were basically concatenating the discipline information from these different disciplinary traditions. And we recognized very quickly when we had so much trouble doing this, that it wasn't just a modeling challenge or a matter of, chaining uncertainty through a series of models, but that these disciplines fundamentally focused on data and findings at vastly different spatial and temporal scales, and the extent to which they were highly quantitative or not, extremely, it varied an extreme amount as well. And so we ended up, as a result of this, publishing a paper. Lee Binda, who's a geomorphologist, was the lead author on this. It was called How to Avoid Train Wrecks When Using Science and Environmental Problem Solving. And it was very much about doing things differently in order to link these disciplines from the very beginning and understand how the differences in scale and the extent to which they were quantitative would influence how that information could be put together. So this was sort of like almost a premonition to what I would discover in even more depth as my career went along, because this was all biophysical kinds of disciplines that were engaged in this. So the second sort of theme of my work, the first is about the fact that, interdisciplinary can be much bigger than simply focusing within either the computational sciences and the biophysical sciences or within those. The second theme is why we do what we do. Now, as environmental scientists, there's a lot of ways to think about this. One way is that we enjoy doing what we do. It's very stimulating. And in fact, I love this quote that a friend of mine told me. She's actually a biophysicist, or a chemical physicist, I should say. And she was giving a talk to a group of school children. And she asked the kids, they were talking about, some of them, how much they like to read. And she asked them, well, why do you like to read? And one of the little boys raised his hand and said, it makes me feel good in my mind. And I just love that quote, because I do think one of the reasons we do what we do is because it's stimulating, it's interesting, and we love being engaged in that process of thinking. But for environmental scientists and many others, there's a much broader reason, and that is because we want to make a difference. There's huge amounts of environmental problems, and because I'm a water scientist, I'm using all these examples from this particular domain. Whether it relates to issues of flooding or, eutrophication, which influences coastal waters or fisheries, there's a variety of issues that we care very deeply about. And I'm going to suggest that focusing on these from a scientific perspective from the natural sciences and computational is necessary, but that it's not sufficient. And one of the reasons is if we look closely at each of those problems, they all have major implications for people. We know from, this is just in the United States. Usually when we think of issues of water problems, we think about the developing world. But if you look around us in the US, major problems in areas like Texas, not just flooding, but huge race and class disparities in that, lack of water in parts of Arizona, polluted fish, droughts in California. So what I'm arguing then is that all environmental problems are social problems. And it doesn't take you long to think about this before you'll agree. There's no question that this is the case. And so another motivation for doing our work is not just that we love to think and talk and collaborate with people, but that we want to try and solve some of these problems. So this is, let me go back now and just, again, beat up on some of my own work. So we want to solve problems, but how have we been going about doing it historically? And I'm right now, the generic we is largely the environmental science community that's focused on the natural sciences. Here's some work I did. This came out back in 2005. And this just shows that as the amount of impervious cover in a watershed increases, biodiversity declines. The number of species, which is just taxa richness, declines dramatically. We know this incredibly well now. There's been hundreds of studies showing this, the shape of that relationship, whether it's linear, whether there's a big threshold drop in biodiversity, we can argue about. There's lots of reasons for that, but we know from repeated studies that that's the case. And so the approach that we took to solve this problem, this is the water science community broadly, was to try and inform restoration practices. And so streams and rivers were restored, and you can just see a couple of examples here. So what did we find? So what basically we found is that those efforts, and this has been shown, so here on the left, I show a synthesis paper from 2011 that I co-authored with colleagues. And on the right is a paper that just is in press now. This figures from a report that was produced prior to the article coming out. And basically what this shows is no matter how much restoration we do, we still see highly degraded biodiversity in streams. So on the left, taxa similarity just simply means what's the composition like in a bunch of streams. Every single data point on that's a different stream in the state of Maryland. And what we see is our reference streams, which are fully forested and our best possible streams in the state, have a very different taxonomic assemblage than those that have in highly degraded areas and even ones that have been restored. So there's no evidence at all that we've shifted and improved biodiversity through our efforts to restore streams. And this is something I said a number of years ago, and there's a whole nother story I could tell you about the fact that managers did not want to listen to this message, and that has a lot to do with how I presented the message and my lack of inclusion of them in the whole research process. So we don't have much evidence of improvement, suggesting our approach didn't really help much solve any problems. So is there evidence that maybe we should have been looking at some of the social drivers? Turns out there's lots of evidence. Just a couple of examples of this. We know now that there's a pretty big disparity in where restoration projects are done. They tend to be much more common in wealthy areas, high socioeconomic status areas. We also know now there's just a recent study that came out in the last year that there's a big difference in willingness to pay for things like restoration at watershed scales and And interestingly, this particular study, again, this was focused on Maryland, is that those people on the largest parcels of land that have higher economic value tend to be the least willing to support programs to restore streams and rivers, which is really, really interesting. So clearly there's social processes involved, and I know that well from a lot of other kinds of efforts that I've been engaged in as well as others. Another example of research that I was involved in, working in the Chesapeake Bay region, there's huge concerns, particularly over the status of blue crabs and oysters in the bay. They're declining, or they have declined hugely. In fact, oysters are less than 1% of their historic abundance. Now, was growing evidence for a number of years that this is largely due to turbid waters in the bay and excessive levels of nitrogen that were entering the bay, largely from runoff. Nitrogen moves in enormous amounts, not just from agricultural areas where there's excessive fertilization and often lack of any riparian corridor to try and trap any of that material, but it also comes from urban areas, both through overland flow, and then in urban areas as well as agricultural. Many of the regions have groundwater that's fully saturated with nitrogen. So even if we stopped it from moving overland, there's going to be a huge lag time. I could also talk about the sediment fluxes. They're huge. So these are the kinds of problems that led to essentially loss of particularly the blue crabs, because the seagrass was lost. Basically, the system flipped from a largely benthic system with clear waters and seagrass to a largely pelagic system with lots of phytoplankton and turbid waters. And I also should say that the oyster problem is also very much due to overharvesting. So it's not just a environmental problem associated with runoff and urbanization. So what was interesting about this, so I worked with a group to publish a paper. This paper must be about 12 or 14 years old now, I'm not sure, to identify, well, what are the biophysical and particularly geomorphic and hydrologic mechanisms that one might think about when restoring rivers and streams in this region to try and trap nutrients and sediments as they're moving down the stream so they don't reach the bay waters. And this resulted in a new form of stream restoration, which is now practiced extensively in the area. And it involves, you see on the left, the overhead picture of a stream that flows directly into the bay waters. The stream is an urban one. It actually originates from a pipe that goes under that highway and was carrying highly polluted water to the bay itself. That restoration project involved filling the stream with sand, creating a series of step water pools so that when stormwater runoff entered that stream, the idea was in these pools, I don't know if you can see my arrow, hopefully you can, in these pools, hydraulic retention would be increased. There'd be time for the bacteria to take up nitrogen and also time for sediment to settle out. And so huge numbers of streams were filled like this. And this shows one in an early stage after about a year, I think a year or two after this one was so-called restored. It's now completely vegetated and turned to a wetland. So basically this converted what was a stream channel to a wetland through a filling and step water process. So was there evidence of improvement from this? Turns out very little. Now we now know it's context dependent, but by and large, even when you restore streams, this is a controlled stream that was not restored. This is work from 2011 that I did with colleague Filoso. These are 3 restored ones, and this is just showing whether or not there was net retention due to the restoration or net export to the bay waters. And what you can see is that the control actually exported more to the bay waters, but there was no significant difference from those that were restored. We found the same sort of thing years later. The amount of sediment moving out of a restoration project into the bay waters was higher than that actually came in, suggesting maybe there was even some additional export due to the project. Most recently, just a project coming out of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center by some collaborators has shown something very similar. That is that the amount of material, in this case, the sediment load coming out of a restored reach is greater than that going in. So a lot of evidence that what we were doing was really just not solving the problem. Now, was there evidence of social drivers in these cases with this new form of restoration or with other kinds of issues related to restoration? Sure. For those of you that are familiar with the Clean Water Act, you may know that, in fact, most agricultural activities are exempt from Clean Water Act requirements. And the urban situation is really different because there are stormwater requirements. But in the Bay Area, in these streams, the vast majority of the nitrogen and to some extent the sediments are coming from agricultural waters. So we don't even have the ability to require, it varies by states. Maryland's actually a little bit better, but we don't have the ability through the Clean Water Act necessarily to mandate restoration activities, planting of riparian corridors, et cetera. We also know that there's huge drivers. Again, I'm talking about the agricultural sector here, even though I gave some urban examples of the projects. If you look at what's been going on with agriculture, we've had a huge shift in how agriculture is done in our region. So this is a big poultry producing area, and we've shifted towards a huge industrialization of the poultry with not as many growers, not as many individual chicken farmers. They mostly work for the big industries. And there's a relationship between poultry production and the inputs of things like pollutants and nitrogen to the bay. So again, very complicated evidence of social drivers. So the question becomes then, why don't we see more collaborative work between environmental and social scientists? And can we foster this more? And if so, will it actually have a bigger impact? And these are the kinds of questions that motivated me to join with others and propose the center that I now direct. Xiaowen mentioned this. It's the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's funded by a very generous grant, $52 million from the National Science Foundation, and also a lot of contributions from the University of Maryland. Interestingly, we're just about to close in another year because our funding is running out. But I want to tell you a little bit about what we did and some of the things we found. But first, let me just mention, for those of you that aren't familiar with synthesis research centers, which NSF now has a history of funding, this basically means we're using existing data, models, and theories to address problems. In this case, problems at the interface of people and the environment. So it's not the kind of work that involves going out and collecting new data. It's more computationally focused. And so synthesis is really just a research method, but it is also a social process, which is something we found and that relates to the form of collaboration. So I want to just mention briefly, when I say we, I'm really referring to a large number of people, but the key leaders that joined me in this were Jonathan Kramer, who has extensive expertise in essentially bridging disciplines in collaborative learning. So he was our director of interdisciplinary science at SCINC and very pivotal to the formation of SCINC. And so was Jim Boyd, who's an economist with Resources for the Future and SCINC. And his training is in economics with a lot of focus on policy. So our center goals were, at least our immediate ones, fell really into two broad categories, fostering new creative research and also building capacity. And when I talk about building capacity, I'm really referring to changing how people think and work more in a direction that fosters bridging the social and the natural sciences. So it's about collaborations, but it's about doing that in ways that really translate to more people doing that, to more communities, and some of those hopefully very enduring. So the center was organized around a theory of change, which is just a fancy word for a plan for how we were going to try and accomplish the things that we wanted to. And so I had showed you just a minute ago what was in the orange right here in the middle, our sort of immediate goals. And those were related to a set of strategies we developed, each one having a core objective. What I want to point out with this is a couple things. This is a useful process, and I'll say we did have an external expert work with us on this to develop this, really focusing on really what we wanted to accomplish, sort of the ultimate societal goal. This is what NSF would call the broader impacts. Now, what's fun about this is that this expert helped us really understand that we have to accept that there is a horizon of accountability. That is, we all know that we may have impact broadly, but actually attributing that specifically, the kind of social changes and big solutions to problems that involve social change, one can never, our center can never take full credit for because so many other things are going on. And that was an important part of this. I don't want to harp on this too much, but it really helped us move through understanding, well, what are sort of the stages of the kinds of impacts we could have? And how could we measure those and make sure that what we're doing to try and accomplish those is actually having some impact? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those strategies because those are very much about how we designed the center programs, the processes, the way we led the center, the way we engaged with those that came to the center to work. And maybe I should just back up and say, as a synthesis center, we fund teams of collaborators from anywhere in the world to come to the center and spend anywhere from 3 to 5 days, sometimes a week or 10 days, but not usually, multiple times over 2 to 3 years to focus on a hard problem that involves integrating data and theories, models, et cetera, to address that particular problem. SYNC was a little different in that we did not fund groups to come into the center and do this. If they'd already been collaborating extensively, we were wanting to build new communities and new capacities. And so we required that all teams that proposed projects to us, at least 50% of them had never worked previously together. So it was, for many of them, the first time they ever met in person was at the center. And then they begin their project, usually by focusing on, I'll talk about that process, but often they came starting out just to focus on the data, which is something we tried to change a little bit. Our core objectives, each of these is associated with specific programs and activities. And I won't describe all those in detail because I want to give you the high level sort of what we learned. But in identifying those programs and strategies, the way we began was to say, well, what are the challenges we think we're going to face? And so I'm going to mention the big challenges, spend a little time on this, and then talk about sort of some of the things we learned. Well, the first thing is that socio-environmental research, I've sort of said this already, is so interdisciplinary, often transdisciplinary, meaning that people from non-academic sectors are involved. The disciplines are hugely different. There's not just methodological differences, which can be enormous. For example, how do you combine ethnographic data that an anthropologist might have with soil survey data at small spatial scales? But there's also huge epistemological differences, both in terms of, how we, not just the methods, again, epistemology, but how we know what we know. What constitutes valid data and how we go about our scholarly work. And these are not trivial things to try and bridge. I'm going to show you some quotes that give you a sense of flavor for some of the things that were told to us either by an external evaluator who conducted numerous interviews on our teams or by some of our participants. And this evaluator noted from his interviews, which are extensive, that 50% of the teams reported huge problems in this particular area of bridging these disciplines and epistemologies. One interview, he said people talk past each other, and some of this is kind of frustrating, like public health people have ways of testing hypotheses, and social scientists and ecologists have different ones. We have different ways of doing statistics, different standards of evidence, and those were uncomfortable moments. Geez, this person is just looking at this in an entirely different way that right now I don't agree with. So this was a very common thing. Now, I should say conflict's not necessarily bad. It actually, identifying it and addressing it in productive ways actually moved a lot of teams forward in very new directions. The second major challenge that I'll mention is socio-environmental problems belong to a class of problems called wicked problems that I suspect many of you have heard about. So it's not just that we all think maybe the epistemologies and the way we think are a little different from disciplines, but personal differences, because socio-environmental problems involve values and perspectives. So one person's solution to a problem can be another person's problem. And you don't have to think long about what's going on in the US right now in terms of the political differences to recognize that this can be pretty big. And that's true even in scientific groups that work together, scholarly groups. And so for socio-environmental problems, we don't talk about solutions. Instead, I like to say there's distributions of solutions, and those are socially determined, and which ones we choose. A third major challenge, and I would call this a grand challenge, and by that I mean one that I would say is so big that we're only beginning, and when I say we now, I'm talking about the community broadly of researchers beginning to tackle this, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. It's not solved. And that is that socio-environmental systems also belong to a class not just of wicked problems, but complex adaptive systems. So those of you that are familiar with CASs know these are systems where there's lots of interactions. There's multiple components in the system. Each of those, which would be the little square in the diagram, are dynamic. They change through time. They can have major changes, which can be shift the behavior significantly of that particular subsystem, but they also interact and have feedbacks across scales, and these feedbacks can be highly nonlinear. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty associated with these, and it comes just from the nature of how these systems work. Another grand challenge, I would say, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this because it relates to what some of you listening to this are really interested in, is that all socio-environmental problems are essentially geospatial problems. And because of the way we did things at our center, because it was a synthesis center, they were also computationally intensive. So spatial mapping and analysis is fundamental to socio-environmental problems. Almost every single group did this. You know, spatial dynamics really helps, understanding this helps to define, bound, and link processes and patterns. So social processes and social, what we see socially in terms of the patterns, it could be socioeconomic, it could be other things, it could be political preference. Those can be mapped and they need to be linked to biophysical processes. And these operate on vastly different spatial and temporal scales. Geospatial work can also help us identify some of the mechanisms that might explain the patterns we see. And they're also often used to help us identify confounding problems because, for example, if we're looking for relationships between a social and a biophysical process, but it's confounded with other factors which are geospatially distributed, then we have to figure out ways to separate those things. So it helps us work on that. So one of our data scientists wrote me a big hurdle. I wrote them just last week. I said, what do you see now at this point as some of the biggest hurdles in terms of geospatial issues? And he wrote a big hurdle is a lot of people have had training in expensive proprietary geospatial software, notably ARC. So they can't take advantage of the many open source tools that are available. This is a negative for open science and reproducibility, especially for people that aren't part of large institutions with access to expensive software packages. So our center really promoted open source software, and as I'll say later, we taught many courses and we worked a lot. We had a large computational team that did their full-time job was to work with our research teams that came to the center. And one of the biggest issues was always, how do I do this? You know, I don't have ArcGIS, et cetera, et cetera. Another one wrote, another important issue is visualizing uncertainty in maps. We're trying to get away from black and white, yes or no approaches to communicating evidence. Statistical methods to do that kind of uncertainty analysis are better, and their ease of implementation has improved a ton in the past few years. But obviously, the main currency of geospatial data visualization is the map, and it's kind of hard to easily and simply show uncertainty. So maps can often lead to misleading false sense of confidence and precision. So this becomes extremely important when you're trying to convey problems, findings, ideas to policymakers and others, but also just to other scientists. Another data scientist said a major challenge for socio-environmental scholars, especially with increasing spatial and temporal resolution of data, is how to handle privacy, since natural scientists often don't get training in things like IRB. You know, how do you make sure that you can't identify individuals or communities or subjects if it is information that needs to be kept private? And another wrote that two other types of geospatial data come to mind as hard to use and not well integrated into geospatial software are data with a time dimension, that is multi-temporal tracking data and georeference photos. So one source of data that the social scientists now use extensively and did it succinct is things like, unstructured data, photographs, tweets, what people are saying over time, that type of information. And the external evaluator wrote, I found this fun to read because it goes against what people tend to think. Team leaders reported that social scientists, this is for one team reported that social scientists tended to dominate team interactions in part because the natural scientists who were chosen lacked skills in spatial analysis and computational modeling. And I do chuckle at this because we did find, more so in the earlier years, but still somewhat persistent in the later years, that there were issues of power and privilege in teams. And oftentimes there was dominance by the natural scientists. And there was an assumption that all social scientists were qualitative. And of course, there's a lot of computational social scientists now. And so that was a learning process for many. Okay, now I'm going to talk in sort of an informal way about how we overcame some of the challenges. So this will tell you a little bit about some of the processes and programs we put in place, but also some lessons that we learned from trying to enhance collaborations and build capacity. So one thing we learned that it's not easy for people to identify collaborators that are really outside their discipline. So there was a real problem that natural scientists had knowing, oh, I don't know any social scientists who work on this. I don't know who to contact. We found, for example, that many biophysical scientists working on climate change approached the problem primarily from, climate downscaling models, et cetera, and had no idea the extent to which sociologists have been working on issues of climate change. So the knowledge of what's going on in other disciplines can be lacking. Sometimes the motivations are misguided in terms of, what determines who is asked, but that's less common than the knowledge is lacking. So one of the ways that we got around this is we fundamentally changed the way we reviewed proposals that for projects we would fund and how those decisions were made. I'm not going to talk about the process. Let me just say the proposals were only 3 to 4 pages, but very specific kinds of information had to be included. And we had to work with our external our external evaluators, we would bring in panels, much like NSF does, but we wanted to do business totally differently than the way NSF did, in that it wasn't just an up or down, the proposal fared well or didn't. The review process was focused on how we could help the team. If there was a kernel of a good idea, then the team was allowed to get that feedback on ways the project could be improved and iterate quickly with the leadership to revise that. When I say quickly, within a month to 2 months max. And so I would say well over 50% of all projects that we ended up funding fell into this category. And one of the most common things was, you don't realize perhaps that there are social scientists working in this area. And our panelists would recommend you might want to consider work by this person or people like that. And so giving them very specific input and not making it just a one-off proposal process. This helped to grow capacity and build communities because they learn during the proposal process itself. We developed a different kind of postdoctoral program. We had between 12 and 18 postdocs in residence at all times. They each had 2-year fellowships, and they had to propose their own independent project focused on some form of socio-environmental synthesis. But in addition to that, we had a program we called Immersion, in which scholars from all the major disciplines that really brought knowledge to bear on socio-environmental problems did interactive workshops with them on essentially the theoretical and methodological lens through which they approach their research. So this was building capacity to understand by, say, an ecologist or a computer scientist. How do anthropologists do their work? And what are some of the key questions and theories that drive what they're doing? We weren't trying to turn an ecologist into a social scientist or an economist into, hydrologists, but simply to give them enough education that when they left, they could pursue more integrative work. And many of them started that while they were at SCINC. We then also worked with teams before and during the periods when they met to help them. Agenda design sounds so boring. It was so much more than that. It was how to run the meetings, how to organize them to maximize interaction and to ensure that it wasn't just the leaders, so-called leaders, running the meetings. It wasn't top down. And we would provide what we called enhancements. So we tried to be very flexible. So for example, and this is where I say timing can be off. Sometimes the group would have to be into the project after a meeting, sometimes 2 meetings, before they realize, we really need a blah, blah, somebody with a particular expertise or knowledge base. And we would allow them to add team members and support them. Ensuring diverse teams turned out to be really important, and to somewhat to our surprise, but once we thought about it, it made sense, is that functional team diversity is what's most important. That is, it's not just demographics. We care deeply about that, to have young scholars, old scholars, ethnically, racially diverse groups, but it's their skills, their competencies, also what networks they're connected to. That made a big difference in the outcome and the novelty of the group's work. And there actually is research by people, scholars in this arena, that have shown that as team size increases, the novelty and the impact of the work increases, but it really has more to do with the diversity, that functional team diversity, and also the level of network, the number of networks that team has that influence some of the impact. Just to give you one quick example, we had a group that focused on conservation and human health. And this was one of the most diverse groups we had. You could see that individuals in that group, the disciplines that they came from, it was a large group. About 13 ended up participating fully. It was an incredibly computationally intensive project. We did not provide facilitation services for this group during their meetings like we did for many groups. They were incredibly productive. They had at least the bean counting ways that scientists often measure impact by articles like in Nature and Science and news pieces. this group really did have a strong impact. So this is a story. There's no proof of, well, I'm not going to go down that path. It's very difficult to measure impacts on people and impacts on society. What do we learn with respect to team processing? Well, teams undergo a social learning process that often starts out, I don't want to say shaky, but it's hard. And if they keep their dialogue not just about what they're doing and about the data, but about how they're doing it and how the team's interacting, if they keep that up throughout the process, they tend to be better teams. And by that, I mean, they're more satisfied with what they've done, and they also tend to be more productive in terms of the bean counting. Power disparities were very common, and when leadership was really flexible, things tended to work the best. Shared visions need to be developed and revisited often. Now, what about bridging epistemologies and methodologies? Well, one thing we found is that if you shift the way the problem's framed from a biophysical or purely scientific problem to a social problem, that tends to pull things together, and they tend to approach things in different ways. Just a quick example. When somebody that's like myself with a strong natural science background thinks about water availability, what's the first thing I think? Oh, need for hydrologic models. I have to understand things like evapotranspiration and soil infiltration. But when you pose it as something like stunted growth is associated with water shortages in this area, that is, people are being hurt, the kinds of things that came up in a group looking at this tended to be much more diverse. So things like, well, who has access to the water? Are there gender disparities? What's the deal with water rights and land tenure? How does that relate to water availability for individuals? And how is that resulting in problems with the growth of children? So very different kinds of things people tend to think about. We've also found that using a causal path approach can shift thinking. And one of the ways, so there's lots of things that influence any problem. The one I was just talking about, there's a bunch of variables I just put up. Jim Boyd, our director of social sciences, recently developed a guide that helps groups actually use a causal approach to shifting thinking, particularly with regard to actionability. And by that, I mean, who do you want to be your audience? Who's likely to care about this? Who do you need to engage that may be able to use the knowledge you gain so that they can influence how you approach obtaining knowledge to ensure that it is actually something they can use? So one thing that was common is the use of boundary objects. So here's just an example where a group reported that they, and this was extremely common, used framing sessions to guide the rest of their research. They actually ended up publishing about that process and how they used ecological and social thinking to actually try and idealize, conservation interventions. Back to bridging epistemologies, which I talked a lot about earlier. So I said social problems brings people together. I said context and focus on causal pathways helps. Tools also accelerate this process. And so these are things that help, for example, identify and come up with a shared conceptual model or a vision, such as what that group I just mentioned did. But there's other ways. The Toolbox Dialogue Initiative is a project that Sanford Eigenbrod and Michael O'Rourke developed. Instead of developing a visual boundary object, which is what I'm sort of illustrating on the right, it could be geospatial layers. It could be a toy. It could be a causal diagram. But it could also be a process that is, instead of visual, is much more verbal. And so what they did was to come up with ways to give to groups each member individually a set of prompts to which they responded. And then the responses that they made were shared at the end. And what that did was those prompts were designed to help reveal sort of implicit attitudes and views about collaboration, about the kind of data that was needed, et cetera. And it is the process of that discussion, just like it's the process of identifying boundary objects, that helps to bridge those epistemologies. It's not the object itself or the specific answers to those responses to those prompts. It's really the process of talking about why people came up with such different ways to respond to the prompts, or what was needed in, let's say, a geospatial set of layers to define the project. We did a lot of co-production, group elicitation to help them develop some sort of a conceptual model or diagram that they could use to guide their work. Computational capacity was another huge thing we learned an awful lot about. We cannot underestimate the problem in this arena. There's all sorts of issues associated with trying to harmonize heterogeneous data. I would say this is the one thing groups vastly underestimated the most, just getting their data into some shape that they could integrate it across social and spatial domains, or even across physical or biophysical domains. That was a huge issue. And so we worked hard to elevate computational capacity, and this involved a number of different programs. Some of it was one-on-one work with individuals. We even had a process we called gentle interventions, and this was keeping up with teams enough to recognize when they may need some help. A simple example would be not having any understanding of how to take a qualitative set of data and put them into a form that can be combined with highly quantitative data. There are ways to do this, but that's something that many teams were not prepared to do. We had a whole series of workshops and short courses on all of these topics that anyone could take. We covered all the travel and accommodation charges, and some of these were 3 days, some of them a week, some of them 10 days, like the Bayesian modeling one. Now, the last thing, close to the last I want to comment on, is actionability. I talked about the importance of work that matters. We really did want to ensure that the work that was done by groups wasn't just of interest to academics. I will tell you what we learned is, at best, we could shift the academic research along the actionable spectrum a little bit. And when I say actionable, I'm not talking about like the kind of work that might be done at a consulting firm that's tasked with solving a specific problem, like how do we reduce nitrogen in this particular tidal creek? Rather, something that provides fundamental information that's applicable in a lot of situations, and it's solution oriented. Let me just give you a few examples of how our teams span this range and why they rarely went all the way to the actionable side. Some of the real fundamental research that teams undertook. One example is a project that looked at how ecosystem services relate to phylogenetic relationships. They looked at trees and the economic value of different trees. And they mapped those phylogenetically. Well, it turned out that one of the interesting outcomes was that many of the species of trees that are most important economically, that are socially important, are highly clustered phylogenetically, which has implications for things like risk of disease. Because if one particular species has a pest that attacks it, other similarly or phylogenetically related ones may also. So it means that that could tell you something about vulnerability of loss of that particular ecosystem service that's provided by the tree. A more actionable one is the really recent one I love, and we're starting to see others doing this kind of thing, is actually dynamically integrating ways to model behavior change and decision making into environmental modeling, in this case, climate change. And if you know something about IPCC, the social dynamics essentially are scenario driven. They're not dynamically embedded in those models. This is something that's hard to do. And this project led to some specific insights on what could be done to maybe shift how people make decisions. And then a super actionable one, there weren't many like this, where a group actually worked with Fish and Wildlife Service agency people and said, well, given the fact that they have limited resources, they need a better way to, decide what they're going to spend their time on, to try and inform the mandatory, restoration plans for that species. And they did come up with some algorithms and tools that could be used. So I'm just going to end with a few by the numbers kinds of things. Were teams successful with Science Advance? I gave you some stories. We have the numbers. NSF loves this sort of thing. Our groups were highly interdisciplinary. About 30% were social scientists. Now, that if you include the economics, the policy people, public health, humanities, it looks even more interdisciplinary. We also had reasonable amount of cross-sector participation. We call these potential knowledge users. So these could be people from industry, nonprofit groups, or governmental. Typically, these were people who knew more about what was needed to solve the problem, or in some cases had the ability to try and take the scholarship and actually put it into something that would affect change. And by the numbers, lots of publications. Graduate program, highly successful. We're the only center to fund synthesis teams of graduate students, and postdoctoral program, highly successful. Most of them ended up going into academia. We were hoping more would go into decision forming positions where they had impact, but we were pleased with this. With that, I know I went fast at the end, but thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Margaret. That was a fantastic talk. Lots of insights I think could be gleaned from our community here to benefit from learning through your journey. We have some questions in the Q&A box. I don't know whether you could read those directly. I could read it for you. At least I could start maybe the first one.
Sure, I can read them.
Okay.
How does one set realistic expectations when entities like iGuide and Succinct work with communities and address real problems? I would highly advise that you go through that process of a theory of change where you have the multiple steps. It's not something that's easy for a team to do on their own. So having an expert to help with that makes a big difference. And if you focus on the horizon of accountability, then you can only do so much. So you don't obsess about it. So David Tarbotten, nice to hear from you. And Jack Liu, thank you, Jack. Our plans, I'm glad you asked that because here's what we're doing. We are about to roll out a new website as we close down, but there's a team of us that will continue to work for several more years that is resource focused. So it will provide a lot of resources to help teams in the building process, in teaching and learning about socio-environmental systems. We actually will have lessons and lesson guides. And we're hoping that this new website will be useful. Many of the contributions are from Succinct, but many are from the external community. And we're going to be inviting more and more from the external community, from groups like yours, Jack, to provide material for that. And David, let's see. The process of identifying issues for change is practical and progress is feasible. I think this gets back to the response I gave to the former question of the theory of change. I would say, and I'm happy to work with you on this, I would say that it's all really sort of ironic. NSF wants convergence, but really all they do is bean count in the end. All of you have done annual reports for NSF and you know. And so thinking about novel ways to actually identifying the changes that you make in people and in building new communities, which iGuide should be able to do. And how you can measure that is something you can do. There'll always be controversies over it, and you always have to tell stories because these kinds of things are qualitative, and it's well accepted in that community. I will say this is an active area of research. Many of you probably know there's a whole community of science, of teen science folks who are trying to study how you measure this and so forth. Then I hear from Manu, like to comment a bit more on the extent to which field interdisciplinary work, let's see, enhanced action outcomes and how that engagement transpired. Well, for one thing, I should tell you, we're very much now just going into a major evaluation phase. We had a developmental evaluation process, which we used and employed both internally and with an external person. We did that the first 5 years, 6 years. Then we got an external evaluator to do more summative work, but we're still going through that now. I think we had a big impact on building communities and shifting the focus. There's so much more socio-environmental work done now, or socio-ecological, whatever you want to call it. We can't take credit for all that. We get that. There's lots going on out there in the world, but that's okay. And we will provide more documentation of how we think that we can do that. George, yours is a much longer discussion, and I'd like to talk with you about it at some point. I don't think I can address that right now. Let's see. The challenges are prescient.
Yeah, that was Rodney Hobson. I think more broadly in terms of evaluation lens, you talked about a theory of change. I think he was asking about other aspects of evaluation and dimensions of evaluation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot I could say about it. One of the decisions we made, and this is a decision iGuide will have to make, is we made an active decision that our goal was to serve and to build and grow communities. It was not to do an experiment. You know, to really so-called prove, which, you know, from a social science perspective, what is objective, right? I mean, this is a whole issue in itself. But to really demonstrate that specific things we did had an impact, we would have had to withhold our services, the various things we did from some groups, and apply them to others. We chose ethically not to do that. We also, because we had a developmental evaluation process, we rapidly iterated and changed things that didn't work and added things, which meant we were never the same. And we threw everything we had at each team that we could. I will tell you, staffing is a problem because you can only do this. We probably only, well, I would say half of our teams use our computational support, probably only 25% used our full facilitation services and help. And some of that is they didn't know to use it, which was hard to always communicate that. But some of it was, you can only do so much when you have, and we had a staff of 25 people. Now only about 8 of those were in full teen science support. But so it's labor intensive, and we had a really good funding, and most centers don't get that level of funding. We were very lucky. I think that's all. Posting in the Slack, somebody will have to read those. If there's questions in the Slack that actually, whoops, let me get out of this.
No, Margaret, I guess that's for people who are complaining they couldn't see the questions from our team. So I posted those questions on the Slack. So the same questions you are seeing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I'm happy to have longer conversations with people, but I think that pretty much summarizes things. It's, you know, I could write a book, I guess, but I also have my wetland science work on methane fluxes that I'm very, very passionate about. So I'm a little split on how I decide to spend my time. So
Well, luckily, Margaret, we have you on our external advisory board. So we expect more opportunities to learn from your insights and the tremendous experience and the wisdom you've gained through running this amazing center. So in the interest of the time, I know you just got settled in a new location after a trip. So thank you so much again for this very stimulating and inspiring talk, and a lot for us to digest. So enjoy your travel, and thanks so much.
thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I wish you well with the rest of the conference. Take care.
Many thanks.